At dinner, my brother said, "You owe $12,000 in back rent. Pay up or leave." My parents laughed at me. But what I did next left them completely stunned. My name is Dexter. I am 35 years old, and for the better part of the last decade, I have lived a life carefully constructed to keep the peace in a family that never really wanted me. I live in the basement suite of a beautiful, sprawling suburban house. The ceiling above my head constantly creaks with the heavy footsteps of my older brother, Julian. Julian is 38 years old, the undisputed golden child of our family, and according to my parents, he is a man of great importance and immense generosity. The narrative my mother, Clara, and my father, Winston, love to spin to anyone who will listen is that Julian is so successful and so kind-hearted that he allows his struggling little brother to live in his basement out of the goodness of his heart. They tell their friends at their country club that Julian is my savior. The reality, however, is a tightly kept secret that has been eating away at my soul for years. Julian's name is indeed on the master lease of this house. He secured that lease 5 years ago only because Clara and Winston co-signed the documents, leveraging their own retirement assets to guarantee his approval. But Julian does not pay the rent. He never has. Every single month, on the 20th day, I quietly transfer $2,500 directly into Julian's checking account. That money covers exactly 90% of the total rent for the entire property. Julian pays the remaining 10% and handles the utility bills, which he always complains about. He acts like the landlord, strutting around the upstairs living room, hosting parties, and bringing home dates who marvel at his massive house. I stay down in the basement, keeping quiet, treating the space like a hotel room I am overpaying for. My family thinks I am a low-level tech support worker struggling to get by. I have deliberately cultivated this image. I drive a 15-year-old sedan with a dent in the rear bumper. I wear plain, unbranded clothing. I never talk about my finances. The truth is, I am a senior remote software engineer for a major tech firm. I make a very comfortable 6-figure salary. I have no debt, excellent credit, and a substantial investment portfolio. But I hide it. I hide it because I learned a long time ago that in my family, any success I achieve is either ignored or immediately repurposed to serve Julian's needs. If they knew how much money I actually had, they would find a way to make it his. So, I play the part of the invisible, struggling younger brother, paying the lion's share of the bills while Julian takes all the credit. It was a pathetic existence, I admit that now, but it was the only way I knew how to maintain any semblance of a relationship with my parents. To understand why a 35-year-old man would subject himself to such financial and emotional exploitation, you have to look back at the history of my family. I was conditioned to serve Julian from the moment I could walk. When I was 20 years old, I had been working 2 part-time jobs through high school to save up a college fund. I had almost $20,000 sitting in a savings account, ready to pay for my tuition. One afternoon, my father Winston sat me down at the kitchen table. He looked grave. He explained that Julian, who was 23 at the time and supposedly starting a brilliant career in finance, had gotten himself into massive credit card debt. He owed creditors over $22,000, and they were threatening to sue him. Winston did not ask me. He told me. He told me that family helps family, and that Julian's future was at risk. He ordered me to withdraw my savings and give it to Julian to clear the debt. When I protested, my mother Clara intervened. She cried. She told me I was being selfish, that Julian had so much potential, and that my state college degree wasn't as important as Julian's reputation. I broke down and handed over the money. I took out student loans to pay for my own education, loans that took me nearly a decade to pay off. Julian never thanked me. He never paid me back a single dime. 5 years later, when I was 25, the cycle repeated itself. I had finally bought my first decent car, a reliable 4-door sedan. I was proud of it. Julian, meanwhile, had been fired from yet another job and had his leased sports car repossessed. He suddenly landed an interview for a sales position that required a vehicle. Clara called me, her voice trembling with manufactured panic. She said Julian needed a car immediately, or he would lose the opportunity of a lifetime. She demanded I let him use my car. I refused at first, remembering the college fund. But the guilt trips were relentless. Winston called me a terrible brother. Clara said I was trying to sabotage Julian out of jealousy. I caved. I handed Julian the keys. 3 weeks later, he drove my car into a concrete barrier while texting. The car was completely totaled. Julian walked away without a scratch. When I asked him how he was going to reimburse me, Winston stepped in and told me accidents happen and that I shouldn't kick my brother while he was down. That was the dynamic. Julian made mistakes and I paid for them. I stayed in their lives, enduring this treatment, because I foolishly believed that one day they would see my loyalty. I thought that if I sacrificed enough, they would eventually love me as much as they loved him. The illusion I had built began to shatter entirely about 3 weeks before the fateful family dinner. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Julian was out, supposedly at a networking event, though I knew he was probably just playing golf. I went out to the street to check the mailbox. Mixed in with the usual junk mail and catalogs was a certified letter addressed to current resident or tenant. Usually, I leave the mail on the counter upstairs for Julian to sort through, but the return address caught my eye. It was from Mr. Henderson, the actual legal owner of the property. I had met Mr. Henderson a few times over the years when he came by to do maintenance checks. He was a retired contractor, a no-nonsense older gentleman who always seemed annoyed by Julian's arrogant attitude, but appreciated that I kept the lawn mowed and the gutters clean. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened the envelope. Inside was a formal, legally binding 60-day notice to vacate the premises. The letter stated clearly that Mr. Henderson was liquidating his assets to move to Florida for his retirement, and the property was going to be put on the market for sale immediately. All leases, including the month-to-month agreement Julian had defaulted to, were being terminated. I read the letter 3 times, my heart pounding in my chest. 60 days. We had 2 months to pack up and leave. I carefully folded the letter, put it back in its envelope, and left it dead center on the kitchen island where Julian couldn't miss it. I went back down to the basement and waited. I waited for the heavy footsteps. I waited for the angry phone calls. I waited for Julian to come downstairs and tell me we needed to start looking for a new place. I waited for 3 days. Nothing happened. Julian acted completely normal. He complained about the internet speed. He talked loudly on his phone about a new investment strategy, but he never mentioned the letter. By the 4th day, the letter was gone from the counter, thrown into the trash. Julian had read it, and he was deliberately hiding it from me. It hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't going to tell me. He was going to use my rent money for the next month to secure a new luxury apartment for himself, and he was going to leave me sitting in the basement until the sheriff showed up to evict me. He was going to abandon me. The realization that my own brother was planning to leave me homeless finally extinguished the last dying ember of familial loyalty in my heart. The sadness I had carried for years evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I didn't confront Julian. I didn't scream or demand answers. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up the public property records for the county. I found Mr. Henderson's primary contact information. The next morning, while Julian was asleep, I drove to the address listed and knocked on Mr. Henderson's door. He was surprised to see me, but he invited me in. I sat in his living room and laid my cards on the table. I told him I knew about the notice to vacate. I also told him the truth about the rent, that I was the one funding the entire operation, not Julian. Mr. Henderson let out a dry, knowing laugh. He told me he always suspected Julian was a fraud, noting that Julian's rent checks were often late until I moved in 5 years ago and the payments magically became punctual. I asked Mr. Henderson what his asking price was for the house. He named a figure. It was high, but fair for the current market. I took a deep breath, looked him in the eye, and told him I wanted to buy the house. Not with a mortgage, not with financing contingencies, but with a straight cash offer. I offered him $500,000, covering his asking price completely, on the condition that we close the deal quietly and rapidly. Mr. Henderson raised his eyebrows, clearly shocked that the quiet guy from the basement had $500,000 liquid. I showed him a verified statement from my brokerage account on my phone. He smiled, shook my hand, and we had a deal. We entered a private, 14-day escrow period. I hired a real estate attorney to handle the paperwork discreetly. The title search came back clean. The inspections were waived because I already lived there and knew the house inside out. The closing date was set. Escrow would officially close, and the deed would be recorded in my name, just 3 days after the upcoming family dinner that Clara had been planning for a month. I went back to the house, walked past Julian, who was watching sports on the couch, and went down to my basement. I sat in the dark, looking at the ceiling, waiting for the trap to spring. The week leading up to the family dinner was a masterclass in psychological restraint. I had to go to work, interact with Julian in the kitchen, and listen to my mother's voicemails without giving away the fact that I was actively buying the ground beneath their feet. Julian's behavior became increasingly bizarre, further confirming my suspicions. He started buying expensive new clothes. He had a stack of glossy brochures for high-end, luxury apartments in the downtown district sitting on his desk. He would walk around the house talking loudly on his phone to real estate agents, bragging about his income and discussing amenities like rooftop pools and concierge services. He was clearly preparing for a major lifestyle upgrade. But what fascinated me most was his complete disregard for my existence in his plans. He never once asked if I was looking for a new place. He never hinted that our living arrangement was coming to an end. He was treating me like a piece of furniture he was planning to leave behind for the demolition crew. I watched him preen in the mirror, adjusting a new silk tie, oblivious to the fact that his entire reality was about to collapse. Meanwhile, my days were spent communicating secretly with my attorney. I signed the final transfer documents digitally. I wired the $500,000 from my investment account directly to the escrow company. Watching that massive sum of money leave my account was terrifying for a brief moment, but the fear was quickly replaced by a profound sense of empowerment. I was buying my freedom. The attorney assured me that the county clerk was processing the deed and that it would be officially stamped and recorded by Friday morning. The family dinner was scheduled for Tuesday night. The timing was almost poetic. I just had to survive one last night of their toxic theater. Tuesday evening arrived. Clara and Winston pulled into the driveway at exactly 6 o'clock. I could hear Clara's shrill voice echoing in the foyer the moment the front door opened, immediately gushing over Julian's appearance. I took a deep breath, pasted a neutral expression on my face, and walked upstairs to join them. The dining table was set with Clara's good china, a ridiculous formality for a random Tuesday, but Clara loved to play the part of the wealthy matriarch. We sat down to a meal of roast beef and mashed potatoes. Almost immediately, the conversation became a one-sided monument to Julian's supposed greatness. Clara excitedly announced that Julian was up for a massive promotion at his firm, a complete lie, considering I knew he was currently working as an independent contractor with barely any clients. Winston nodded approvingly, raising his glass of wine to toast his eldest son. They talked about his new clothes, his expensive watch, and how proud they were of the man he had become. Then, as always, the spotlight shifted to me, not for praise, but for contrast. Clara looked at my plain gray sweater and sighed heavily. She asked me, in that patronizing tone she perfected over decades, if I was ever going to move up from the help desk at my company. She suggested I take a night class to improve my skills. Winston chimed in, advising me to watch how Julian handles himself in the corporate world. I just nodded, slicing my roast beef, eating mechanically. I didn't defend my career. I didn't tell them I managed a team of 20 engineers. I just let them talk, absorbing the insults, feeling the smooth, cold surface of the legal reality I had built waiting patiently in the wings. I was a ghost at my own family dinner. About halfway through the meal, the atmosphere shifted. Julian cleared his throat loudly, adopting a serious, somber expression. He put his fork down and folded his hands on the table. He looked at Clara and Winston, then turned his gaze to me. He announced that he had some unfortunate news regarding the house. He claimed that he had just had a long, difficult meeting with the landlord. According to Julian, The landlord was furious about the current economic inflation and property taxes. Julian spun a massive, convoluted lie. He said the landlord had audited the lease agreement and realized that we had been drastically underpaying rent for the past 3 years. He claimed there was a hidden clause about market rate adjustments that they had missed. Julian sighed heavily, playing the role of the burdened provider perfectly. He looked me dead in the eye and delivered the ultimatum. He said the landlord was demanding immediate back pay to cover the difference. He told me that my share of this back rent, calculated over 36 months, came out to exactly $12,000. I stopped chewing. I stared at him. $12,000. It was an incredibly specific, absurdly high number. I instantly realized what he was doing. He needed cash for the security deposit and first and last month's rent on one of those luxury downtown apartments he was looking at. He couldn't afford it on his own, so he was trying to extort the money out of me before the 60-day eviction notice ran out. Julian leaned forward, his voice dropping into a harsh, threatening register. He told me I had exactly 1 week to transfer the $12,000 into his account. If I didn't have the money by next Tuesday, he would personally pack my bags and throw them on the front lawn. Pay up or get out. For a few seconds, there was absolute silence in the dining room. I looked away from Julian and turned to Clara and Winston. Part of me, the pathetic, broken inner child that still desperately wanted parents who protected him, expected them to intervene. I expected Winston to recognize the mathematical impossibility of a $12,000 retroactive rent increase. I expected Clara to be horrified that her eldest son was threatening to throw her youngest son out onto the street. Instead, I watched my mother pick up her wine glass, take a sip, and let out a nervous little laugh. She wouldn't even make eye contact with me. She looked at her plate and mumbled that the economy was tough right now and that I really needed to step up and pay my fair share so Julian wouldn't get in trouble. Winston was far less subtle. He slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware rattle. He glared at me, his face red with sudden anger. He accused me of being a parasite. He told me I had been freeloading off my brother's success for years, and it was about time I took some financial responsibility. He demanded I stop being selfish and pay Julian the money immediately. That was the moment. That was the exact fraction of a second where the cord permanently snapped. I looked at the three of them sitting there, united in their delusion and their willingness to destroy me for Julian's benefit. I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no betrayal. Just a vast, empty calm. I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain the law. I didn't yell. I simply stood up from my chair. I carefully placed my napkin on the table. I looked at Julian, whose face was twisted into a smug, victorious sneer, believing he had just successfully bullied me into paying for his new life. I didn't say a single word. I turned my back on them, walked out of the dining room, down the hallway, and descended the stairs into the basement. I closed my door and locked it. Above me, I could hear them start to laugh, already celebrating their victory. Dear friend, if you've watched this far, please help me by liking this video, subscribing to the channel to show your support, and leaving a comment with the name of the city you live in. Every comment helps the video reach more viewers. Thank you very much. The morning after the dinner, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating against the nightstand. It didn't stop. It was a rhythmic, persistent buzzing that felt like a physical assault. I didn't even have to look at the screen to know who it was. I lay there in the dim light of the basement, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, listening to the house above me come to life. I could hear Julian's heavy, triumphant footsteps as he paced around the kitchen directly over my head. He was probably making himself a victory breakfast, confident that he had just secured a $12,000 windfall. I finally picked up the phone. 3 missed calls from Clara. 2 from Winston. A string of text messages that grew increasingly hostile with every passing hour. I opened the first one from my mother. It wasn't an inquiry about how I was feeling or a request for a calm discussion. It was a lecture. She wrote that she was deeply disappointed in my behavior at dinner. She said my silence was passive-aggressive and that by walking away, I had insulted the entire family. She reiterated that Julian had worked so hard to provide a roof over my head, and that the $12,000 was a small price to pay for the luxury of living in such a prestigious neighborhood. Then came the messages from Winston. My father's tone was much sharper. He didn't use words like disappointment. He used words like debt and obligation. He told me that if I didn't have the money transferred to Julian by the end of the week, he would personally come over and oversee my eviction. He called me ungrateful. He said that after everything they had done for me, which, in his mind, consisted of constantly bailouts for Julian while I watched from the sidelines, the least I could do was support my brother in his time of need. I didn't reply to a single one. I didn't defend myself. I didn't point out the illegality of a retroactive rent hike. Instead, I did something I had learned to do early in my career as a developer. I began to document everything. I archived the voicemails. I took screenshots of the texts. I saved every piece of digital venom they sent my way. I felt a strange, detached sense of clinical observation. It was as if I was watching a group of predators circling a prey they didn't realize was already gone. Every nasty word they typed was just another nail in the coffin of our relationship. I spent that Wednesday working from my desk in the basement, my noise-canceling headphones blocking out the sound of Julian's whistling from upstairs. I was waiting. I was just waiting for Friday. By Thursday, Julian's arrogance had reached a fever pitch. He was no longer even trying to hide his plans. He left the front door open frequently, and I could hear him talking to various utility companies, asking about transfer fees for a new address downtown. He was already picking out furniture online. I caught a glimpse of his laptop screen when I went upstairs to get water. He was looking at a penthouse apartment that cost $4,000 a month. He was counting on my $12,000 to cover the massive deposit and the first few months of his new life. It was pathetic, really. He was a 38-year-old man playing a high-stakes game of make-believe, and he was using me as his unwilling financier. He cornered me in the hallway Thursday evening. He smelled of expensive cologne, the kind he definitely couldn't afford on his own. He leaned against the wall, blocking my path to the stairs, a smug grin plastered across his face. He asked me if I had sorted out the logistics yet. He told me he didn't want to be the bad guy, but that he had already talked to a friend in real estate who told him that he could have a new tenant in the basement by Monday if I didn't pay up. "I'm just looking out for the family, Dexter," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "The landlord is breathing down my neck. You don't want to be the reason I lose my standing with him, do you?" I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in years. I saw the desperation behind the smugness. I saw the fear of a man who knew his 60-day clock was ticking and had no actual plan other than theft. I didn't blink. I didn't show any emotion. I simply looked him in the eye and said, "Everything will be legally sorted out by Friday evening, Julian. You'll have exactly what you deserve." He let out a loud, barking laugh and slapped me on the shoulder. He took that as a sign of defeat. He thought I was caving. He told me he knew I'd see reason eventually and that we could all have a celebratory drink once the money cleared. He walked away, whistling a tune, convinced he had won. I went back down to my room and checked my email. My attorney had sent over the final confirmation. The county recorder's office was processing the deed. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, the house would officially be mine. I sat at my desk and began drafting the text message I would send to the family. I kept it short. I kept it professional. I invited them over for a final settlement meeting at 7 o'clock on Friday. The trap was set. Friday morning was the quietest morning of my life. I woke up at 7 o'clock, but I didn't get out of bed. I just listened to the silence of the house. Julian was still asleep, probably exhausted from dreaming about his penthouse. At exactly 9:15, my phone rang. It was my attorney. "Congratulations, Dexter," he said, his voice crisp and professional. "The deed has been officially recorded. You are now the sole legal owner of the property. The funds have been dispersed to Mr. Henderson, and the title is clear. You are officially the landlord." I thanked him and hung up. I felt a sudden, sharp intake of breath. For 35 years, I had been the little brother, the invisible son, the backup plan. Now, for the first time, I was the one who held the keys. Literally. I went to the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee. I sat at the table and looked out at the backyard, the yard I now owned. I thought about Mr. Henderson, who was probably halfway to Florida by now, happy to be rid of the headache that was my brother. I spent the next 2 hours drafting the formal legal documents. I didn't use a template from the internet. I had my attorney provide the official notice to quit and notice of termination of tenancy for Julian. I printed them out on high-quality paper. I placed them in a clean, white manila folder. I felt a strange sense of peace as I looked at Julian's name on the eviction notice. It wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about balance. It was about finally ending a cycle of abuse that had been running since I was a child. At noon, I sent the group text. Clara, Winston, Julian. Please meet in the living room at 7 o'clock tonight. I have the settlement for the $12,000 ready. We will finalize everything then. The responses were almost instantaneous. Clara sent a series of heart emojis and said she was so glad I was doing the right thing. Winston sent a thumbs up and told me he was proud of me for stepping up. Julian didn't reply, but I heard him shouting in excitement from the living room upstairs. He probably thought his new life was starting tonight. I spent the rest of the afternoon packing a small bag of my most essential items, just in case things turned violent. I wasn't afraid, but I was prepared. I knew that by 8 o'clock tonight, the family I had known my entire life would be gone forever. The sun was just beginning to set when Clara and Winston pulled into the driveway. Through the living room window, I watched them get out of their car. They were dressed up as if they were going to a celebration. Clara was wearing a floral dress and a string of pearls. Winston had on a blazer. They looked like the picture of suburban success. They walked into the house with a sense of ownership, their voices loud and cheerful. Julian met them at the door, beaming. He was wearing a new tailored shirt, likely bought on credit in anticipation of the $12,000. I stayed in the basement until I heard them all settle in the living room. I could hear the clinking of glasses. Julian had opened a bottle of wine. They were laughing, talking about Julian's big move and how this money was going to change everything. They were already spending the money I hadn't even given them yet. It was nauseating. I took a final look around my basement suite, the place I had hidden for 5 years, and I felt a surge of resolve. I picked up the manila folder and walked up the stairs. As I entered the living room, the conversation died down. They all turned to look at me, and for a second, I saw a flicker of something in their eyes. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was just greed. But it was quickly replaced by those practiced, patronizing smiles. Dexter. Come in, Winston said, gesturing to the armchair across from the sofa. We were just talking about how much we appreciate you taking this seriously. It's a big step toward being a man, son. Clara nodded eagerly. We're so proud, Dexter. We knew you'd understand that family comes first. Julian just sat there, leaning back with his arms crossed, a look of pure, unadulterated smugness on his face. He didn't even say hello. He just looked at the folder in my hand as if it was a trophy he had already won. I sat down slowly. I didn't pour myself a drink. I didn't smile. I placed the folder on the coffee table between us. The silence in the room became heavy, thick with their expectation. I felt a strange, cold detachment. I wasn't their son or their brother in that moment. I was a business owner dealing with a group of delinquent squatters. I told you I'd have the settlement ready by Friday, I said, my voice flat and steady. And I do. But before we get to the money, I want to make sure we all understand the legal reality of the situation. Julian scoffed. Legal reality? Dexter, don't be dramatic. Just hand over the check so we can move on. Winston frowned. Now Julian, let him speak. He's earned that much, at least. I looked at Winston. I've earned a lot more than that, Dad. I've earned 15 years of my life back. But let's start with the house. I slid the folder toward the center of the table. Open it, Julian. Go ahead. Julian reached for the folder with a bored sigh, flipping it open with one hand while holding his wine glass with the other. He expected to see a cashier's check for $12,000. I watched his eyes scan the first page. I watched the moment the boredom vanished. His brow furrowed. He put his wine glass down on the table, his movements suddenly jerky. He pulled the document closer to his face, his lips moving silently as he read the words special warranty deed and grantee, Dexter, last name. The silence in the room was absolute. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantelpiece. I could hear the distant sound of a lawnmower outside. Julian's face went from pale to a sickly, grayish white. He flipped to the second page, then the third, his hands starting to tremble. What is this?" he stammered, his voice cracking. This says the property was sold." Clara leaned in, her brow pinched in confusion. "Sold? What do you mean sold?" "Julian, what are you talking about?" Winston snatched the folder out of Julian's hands. He squinted at the text, his face reddening as he processed the legal language. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. I felt a sense of immense, quiet power. "It's a deed, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I bought the house. I contacted Mr. Henderson 2 weeks ago after I found the eviction notice Julian was hiding from me. I made him a cash offer of $500,000. The escrow closed this morning. I am the sole legal owner of this entire property. Land, house, and everything in it." Winston dropped the folder onto the table as if it were burning his hands. He looked at me, then at Julian, then back at me. $500,000? Cash? Where would you get that kind of money? "I'm a senior software engineer, Dad," I replied calmly. "I've been making 6 figures for years. I just didn't tell you because I knew if I did, you'd find a way to give it to Julian. Just like my college fund. Just like my car. Just like everything else I've ever worked for." Julian finally found his voice, but it was high-pitched and panicked. "You can't do this. I'm the one on the lease. My name is on the paperwork." "The lease you let default to a month-to-month agreement?" I asked, leaning forward. "The lease that Mr. Henderson terminated 3 weeks ago with a 60-day notice you threw in the trash? That lease is gone, Julian. You're not a tenant anymore. You're a guest. And your invitation has just been revoked." The explosion happened exactly as I expected. Winston stood up, his chair flying backward and hitting the wall with a loud thud. He started screaming about betrayal and dishonor. He called me a snake, a coward who went behind his brother's back to steal his home. Clara began to sob, a loud, performative wailing, accusing me of tearing the family apart. She kept repeating that Julian had nowhere to go, that I was heartless, that I was a monster. Julian, meanwhile, had moved from shock to pure, unadulterated rage. He lunged across the table, grabbing the front of my sweater. "You think you're smart? You think you can just buy me out? This is my house. I've lived here for 5 years. I didn't move. I didn't even try to push him off. I just looked him in the eye, my face inches from his. It was never your house, Julian. It was a house I paid for while you pretended to be a success. It was a house where you tried to extort $12,000 from me because you were too lazy to get a real job." I reached down and pulled the second document out of the folder. "This is a formal 30-day notice to vacate. It's been filed with the city. If you aren't out by the end of next month, I will have the sheriff come and remove you and your belongings from the premises. And since I'm the owner, I've already contacted the utility companies. The accounts will be switched to my name tomorrow. I suggest you start looking for one of those luxury apartments you were bragging about." Winston tried to step between us, his finger jabbing at my chest. "You listen to me, boy. You are going to tear up those papers right now. We are your parents. You will do what we say." "No," I said, and the word felt like a mountain. "I'm 35 years old, Winston. I'm not the kid whose college fund you stole. I'm not the kid who gave up his car so Julian could crash it. I'm a man who just bought a house, and I'm a man who is finished with all of you. You wanted to talk about legal reality and fair shares? Well, this is it. This is your fair share. You get 30 days to help your golden son move out. After that, if any of you set foot on this property without my permission, I will call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." Clara stopped crying and stared at me with pure hatred. "You're dead to us, Dexter. Do you hear me? You have no family anymore." "I haven't had a family for a long time, Mom," I said quietly. "I just finally realized it. I stood up and walked toward the door. I didn't look back. I went down to the basement, locked the door, and listened to them scream and argue in the living room for another hour before they finally left, the tires of Winston's car screeching as they sped away. The next 30 days were a strange, slow-motion exercise in endurance. Julian stayed in the house, but we never spoke. I stayed in the basement, only coming up when I knew he was out. I heard him moving boxes. I heard him on the phone, his voice desperate and pleading, likely asking Clara and Winston for money to cover a deposit he no longer had a way to steal from me. I saw moving trucks come and go. He took everything that wasn't nailed down, furniture I had paid for, electronics I had bought, but I didn't care. It was a small price to pay to have him gone. On the 30th day, I waited until I saw his car pull out of the driveway for the last time. I walked upstairs. The house was empty, echoing, and stripped bare. It smelled of Julian's cologne and stale wine. I didn't feel sad. I felt a profound sense of relief. I called a locksmith who was already on standby. Within 2 hours, every exterior door in the house had a new, high-security lock. I walked through the rooms one by one, opening the curtains and letting the sunlight in. This was my house, my home. I sat on the floor in the middle of the empty living room and pulled out my phone. I saw dozens of missed calls and texts from my parents, ranging from death threats to pathetic pleas for reconciliation. I didn't read them. I didn't archive them this time. I simply went into my settings and blocked every single one of their numbers. I blocked them on social media. I blocked their email addresses. I erased them from my digital life as thoroughly as I had erased them from my physical one. I spent the evening sitting on the back deck, watching the stars come out. For the first time in my life, there was no one above me. No heavy footsteps, no demands, no guilt. Just the sound of the wind in the trees and the quiet hum of the refrigerator. I thought about the $12,000 Julian had tried to take. It seemed like such a small, petty amount now. He had tried to trade his brother's life for a luxury apartment. He had lost everything instead. I realized then that the house wasn't the real prize. The real prize was the silence. The real prize was the fact that I could finally wake up tomorrow morning and be whoever I wanted to be, without having to hide. I was 35 years old, and my life was finally beginning. Am I wrong for kicking my own brother out of my house and cutting my parents out of my life? Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. Your support means the world. Have a wonderful day.